Hello, well it's a wet, miserable night here in Lincoln. It's the middle of December, so the days are dark and mostly wet and miserable. I'm unable to get out and about on my travels and do any of my videos. I won't be able to do that till the spring, so in the meantime I'm going to do something I haven't done for a long time. I'm going to tell a ghost story. Now, as a kid I used to love the Ghost Stories for Christmas series that the BBC would screen every Christmas Eve back in the 1970s. And this reading is inspired by those adaptations. Oh, and top marks if you can guess my rather bad impression of a certain British character actor of the 1940s. Now, those who watch my videos will know that I like to visit old churches. The church in this particular story, however, is one that I certainly wouldn't want to visit. The bishop was a skeletal man, with long, unwrinkled fingers and raised dark veins that ran across his pale skin like tree roots over snowy ground. I watched as the fingers of his left hand curled slowly and carefully around the bowl of his pipe, while his right hand gently tapped tobacco into the hollow. There was something almost spider-like about the way those fingers moved. I didn't like the bishop's fingers, but then I didn't like the bishop.
"How have you been, Mr. Passenger?" the bishop asked, when his pipe was lighted to his satisfaction. I thanked him for his concern and assured him I was feeling much better. I still had some trouble with my nerves, and at night I twisted in my sleep to the sounds of shelling and the scurrying of rats in the trenches. There was little point in telling that to the man before me. "I was hoping you might have found a living for me," I replied. The bishop waved those arachnid fingers in response. "In time, Mr. Passenger, in time. We must walk before we can run. You know Chetwynd Dark, I assume?" I knew it. Chetwynd Dark was a small parish, perhaps a mile or two from the southwest coast. One minister, hardly any parishioners, and not the most rewarding of livings. But there had been a church there for a very long time. "Mr. Fell currently has responsibility for the parish," said the bishop. "Despite possessing many amiable qualities, he has endured his difficulties in the past. He has taken to locking the church, I hear, from the inside. He also appears to be engaged in some form of renovation work for which he is temperamentally and vocationally ill-suited. His congregation has heard him digging and hacking at the stones within, although I'm told there are as yet no obvious signs of damage to the chapel itself." "What would you have me do?" I asked. "I want you to talk to him. Try to understand him. Have him committed if necessary, but I want this to stop. Do I make myself clear, Mr. Passenger? I want no more trouble from Mr. Fell." And with that, I was dismissed. The next day, the train brought me to Evenstow. From there, a car arranged by the bishop collected me and brought me 10 miles west to Chetwynd Dark. It was raining, and I could smell salt on the air as I walked up the path to the minister's house. A light burned in the depths of the house, but when I knocked, no one came. I tried the door. It opened easily, revealing a wooden hallway leading to a kitchen straight ahead, with a flight of stairs to the right and a doorway to the left into the living room. "Mr. Fell," I called, but there was no reply. In the kitchen, some bread lay on a plate, covered by a tea-cloth, a jug of buttermilk beside it. Upstairs, both bedrooms were empty. One tidy, with spare blankets laid out carefully on the base of a newly made bed, but the other bedroom was strewn with clothes and half-eaten food. The sheets upon the bed did not appear to have been laundered in some time, and there was a smell from them, as of an old man's unwashed body. Yet it was the writing desk that drew my attention, for it, and what lay upon it, had obviously been the focus of Mr. Fell's interest for some time. 3 old manuscripts, so yellow and worn that the writing had almost faded away, occupied pride of place at the centre of a storm of papers. The language was Latin, but the script was in no way ornate. Instead, it was neat, almost businesslike. At the end, besides an illegible signature, was a darker stain. It looked like old dried blood. I turned to the third part of Mr. Fell's ongoing work. He had obviously encountered the greatest difficulty with this section. The translation was littered with gaps or guessed words indicated by question marks, but he had underlined the terms of which he was certain. They included entombed and malefic. But there was one he repeated again and again throughout the text, and which Mr. Fell in turn emphasized in his translation. The word was Daemon. I left my bag in the second uncluttered room and looked out of the window. It faced towards the chapel, and there I saw a light burned. I watched it flicker for a time and went downstairs. And remembering Mr. Fell's reported habit of locking the church, I searched until I found a set of dusty keys in a small cabinet. I made my way to the church. The front entrance was locked, and through a gap in the door I could see that a bar had been raised across it from within. I knocked hard and called Mr. Fell's name, but there was no reply. I was walking to the rear of the church when close by the east wall, but low, almost as if it came from beneath the ground, I heard a slight noise. It was the sound of someone tunnelling, slowly, inch by inch, and yet, listen though I might, I could not discern the use of any tools. It was as if all the work were being done by hand. I continued quickly to the back door and tried each key in turn, until the lock clicked and I found myself standing in an alcove above the chapel, with the carved heads of the cornices above me. And as I stood, the sound of digging came again. "Mr. Fell," I called, and I was surprised to find my voice catching in my throat. The first thing I noticed was the hole in the floor. Besides stood an oil lamp, its fuel almost depleted, so that the flame was tiny and flickering. A number of stones had been removed and placed against the wall, leaving a gap big enough for a man to squeeze through. The hole itself was dark and dropped gently down, but I thought that I could discern another light deeper within. I was about to call again when the digging resumed, this time with greater urgency, and the sound made me stumble back in fright. I knelt at the opening, and I caught the smell that came from within, faint but definite, the stench of decay. I took my handkerchief from my pocket and wrapped it around my nose and mouth, and then I sat on the lip of the hole and gently lowered myself down. The tunnel was narrow and sloped, and I felt myself sliding on the stone and loose earth for a few feet. The lamp held low before me in case it might break upon the roof. For a moment I feared that I might fall into some great chasm, with only darkness around me as I plummeted, never to be found again. Instead, I landed on stone, and found myself in a low tunnel, perhaps only 4 feet at its highest point. It was intensely cold in the tunnel. The sound of digging was stronger and more noticeable now, but so too was the smell of decay. The digging grew closer and closer, the tunnel ever cooler. It was narrower now, and far more difficult to negotiate, but I found myself hurrying, my curiosity briefly overcoming my unease. I was crouched, almost double, and the stench was becoming unbearable, when I rounded a corner and my foot touched something soft. I looked down, and heard myself moan. A man lay at my feet, his mouth contorted and his face deathly white. His eyes were open, and there was blood in the corneas, where tiny vessels had burst under some dreadful pressure. His hands were raised slightly as if to ward off something before him. The clothes of his ministry were tattered and filthy, but I had no doubt I was in the presence of the late Mr. Fell. When I looked up, I saw what I thought at first was simply a stone wall, but at the centre of the wall was a hole big enough for a man's head to fit through. From behind it came that picking sound, and I knew then what I had been hearing. It was not Mr. Fell digging down, but something else digging up. I raised the lamp and examined the breach in the wall. At first I saw nothing. The wall was so thick that my light barely penetrated through the hole. I drew closer, and suddenly there was a gleam from within, as the lamp caught a pair of eyes, entirely black, as if the pupils had permanently enlarged themselves over time, desperately seeking light in that dark place. Then the image was gone, and a moment later the presence in the chamber struck the wall from behind. I heard it grunting with effort as it retreated and threw itself once more against the barrier. Dust descended upon me from the roof, and I thought I heard some of the stones in the wall shifting. A claw appeared through the hole. Its fingers were long, impossibly so, and appeared to be jointed at least 5 or 6 times. Huge curved nails erupted from the ends, clouded with dirt. A grey scaling covered the bones, and thick dark hairs protruded from the cracks in the skin. It reached for me, and I felt its fury, its malevolence, its searing, desperate intelligence, and its absolute loneliness. It had been imprisoned here, in the darkness, for so long, until Mr. Fell had commenced his translation. The beast hurled itself again against the wall. A fine tracery of cracks shot out from the hole at its centre like threads on a spider's web. I retreated, backing further and further away from it, until the tunnel grew wide enough so that I felt that I could turn. For a moment I thought that I had trapped myself in doing so, and found that I could go neither backwards nor forwards. Now the beast was howling, but in between its cries I thought I could discern words, although they were spoken in a language that I had never heard. With a final effort that tore my coat sleeve from my arm and ripped open a wound in my skin, I freed myself and ran. I heard stones falling behind me, and I knew that the creature was close to breaking through. Seconds later my fears were realized, for I discerned the sound of its clawed feet upon the stones as it pursued me through the tunnel. There came the sound of those talons, scraping on stone, moving faster and faster as I groped for the ropes, found them and pulled. Nothing happened. I heard iron bolts falling, but no more. A clawed hand appeared at the edge of the tunnel, its nails scraping along the stones, and I prepared to die. But as I closed my eyes, something rumbled above me, and I pushed myself back instinctively. The tunnel shook as the beast advanced, and a shower of rocks fell at my feet. I heard the thing roar, and suddenly it was lost from sight as the ceiling collapsed. Yet I thought that I could still hear it as the rocks descended, howling in rage and frustration as it retreated further and further in its efforts to escape burial beneath tons and tons of rubble. Then I too was running, until at last I was hauling myself up into the blessed calm of the chapel, and the dust was belching from the hole, and the sound of the stones falling seemed to go on and on forever. I received my living. It is a small church, an old church. There is sunken ground nearby, and visitors sometimes stop and stare at this unexplained and recent phenomenon. Some damage to the floor of the chapel has been repaired, and a new larger stone set in the place where Mr. Fell began his excavations. That stone now marks his burial site. I have few parishioners and fewer duties. I read, I write, I take long walks by the seashore. And sometimes, when I'm in the church alone at night, I believe that I can hear it digging, patiently and intently, moving tiny stone after tiny stone. Its progress is infinitely slow, yet still progress for all that. It can wait, after all. It has eternity.